As President Roosevelt led America into the World War II against the Axis powers in the 1940s and the Cold War against Communist Russia in the 1950s, social issues on the home front continued to remain a challenge. The impact of both wars influenced social issues by challenging existing thoughts and behaviors and raising awareness of various issues ranging from African American civil rights and equality to conforming to traditional norms and roles. The war itself raised questions about our claims as leaders of the free world while still discriminating against African Americans. As NAACP Secretary Walter White says in the primary documents, just as Hitler used the Jews as scapegoats to bring Nazis into power in Germany, so similar forces today are attempting to use the Negro question in the United States. Mr. White is saying that if the Negro lives in fear of lynching and discrimination based on their skin color, then the purpose of us entering the war as leaders of the free world are built on lies. Proposed legislation that would enhance civil rights issues were met with opposition primarily from Southern congressmen who aimed to keep the status quo and were influenced by congressmen such as Martin Dies, the first chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And he branded liberals and those supporting liberal ideas as communists. In the NAACP telegram to President Roosevelt, they argued that 3 lynchings within 5 days in Mississippi are as much sabotage of one nation's war effort as a bomb in an airplane factory or shipyard. So there was some support for these civil rights initiatives. However, they were labeled as anti-American. Senator Richard Russell from the primary documents writes that the lynch bill was of particular interest to the communists as part of their program to enlist all of the Negroes within their party. The issues were continually delayed for a vote by successfully filibustering by Senator Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi. As he writes, "I have not spread them in expressing my disagreement with any white man or white woman who would sponsor any movement that would integrate the American Negro into the social life of the white people in this country." Although the African Americans fought side by side with the whites during World War II, evidence shows that racism and the strong desire to conform to the status quo remained in the 1940s. The Jewish refugee crisis is another issue that was directly shaped by World War II. Our government seemed to almost ignore the pleas of the immigrants. As this memorandum from the Roosevelt Library states, it is the opinion of the Department of State that it would not be appropriate for the President to support an appeal for assistance for one particular class of refugees or for refugees from one particular country. I think this reinforces the idea that the United States was solely focused on winning war. That was our number one priority. We did not want to address the issues that came up as a result of Germany persecution of the Jews during the war. So this leaflet was dropped in Los Angeles and reflected what many white Americans believed at the time, that the Roosevelt administration is quote-unquote loaded with Jews. The Jews are people of vultures living on the labor of the rest of the world, and that communism is Jewish. So although there was some support obviously from the Jewish community in America to allow immigration, the vast majority of Americans and the government did not support the effort. As Senator Harry Truman stated, remember that the main effort is now for the United States to win the war as quickly as possible. So although some Jews were admitted into the U.S. during the war, it does not appear that the U.S. persuaded an organized rescue policy for Jewish victims of Nazi Germany until close to the end of the war. The Cold War was a clash of very different beliefs and ideology. It's capitalism versus communism. This clash developed between the United States and Soviet Union during World War II, but escalated in the 1950s. The Cold War and the fight against communism influenced many in America to conform. People did not want to be suspected of having communist leanings, and workers and politicians feared for their reputations and their jobs, so the idea of conforming was to avoid suspicion. The idea of conforming led to internal rebellion, although, in the United States, as singers and actors use a public stage to challenge mainstream norms and highlight the issue of gender equality. In 1956, Elvis Presley challenged the cultural norm of segregation by remaking the African-American original song, Hound Dog, which was sang by Big Mama Thornton in 1952. So he turned it into a song that was upbeat and really kind of sexually provocative, and it appealed to the mainstream America, especially young girls. He presented himself as sexy but shy, and growing tired of the affection that came his way. And he wore long sideburns, which was a style of the beat hipster generation, all of which were contrary to the conservative norm of the times. A second example of rebelling against conforming is found in Malvina Reynolds' song Little Boxes. In this song, she mocks people who conform to cultural norms by living in the same type of houses with different colors, and going to the same type of university, and coming out as the same type of people. Then they pass this idea of conformity to their children, who wind up doing the same exact thing as they did. Gender equality was also an issue shaped by Cold War thinking. During World War II, women were in the workforce, taking the place of men who went off to fight the war. When the war ended and men returned, the women went back to the home to fill the traditional role of homemaker. Those challenging the norm risked being branded as a troublemaker or a communist. However, there were some examples of entertainers using the media to question nonconformity and these gender equality rules. The I Love Lucy clip, just the picture that I'm showing here, it shows that Lucy initially reinforces the idea that husbands are the earners and women are the spenders by overdrawing their bank account. But in the end, Lucy claims that she could earn a living if only she was given a chance. So Lucy and her husband Ricky then agree to flip-flop roles, where Lucy would go out and earn a living and Ricky would stay home and do the housework. One key similarity in our home front issues faced during World War II and those faced during the Cold War was communism. In World War II, people like Senator Dyes used communism as a label to be placed on those who continue to support New Deal initiatives well into the World War II era. The fear of being labeled as a communist successfully slowed efforts to enhance African American civil rights issues, and it reinforced the Southern whites' desire to maintain the status quo. Maintaining the status quo and the fear of being labeled a communist really is what led to conformity during the Cold War. Another similarity was self-preservation of the U.S. and the American way of life. In the World War II era, we cared more about victory over world powers than we did Jewish suffering. In the Cold War era, the focus was on preserving democracy and stopping the spread of communism. A key difference between the wars was that World War II was a physical war with great chance of loss for life. For most, it was easy to align with the common goal of defeating the Axis powers and to end the bloodshed as soon as they possibly could. The Cold War, on the other hand, was a political struggle versus an actual battle. Some factions in America began to challenge norms and did not really rally around a common cause. Another key difference was the role of African Americans and women in American society. During World War II, African Americans and women filled the roles of those that went off to fight in the war overseas. They produced the goods and products that we needed to win the war. During the Cold War, men had returned from the fighting, and the women and the African Americans were almost reverted back to their traditional places before the World War had started. So, although the groundwork for conformity and anti-communist fear had been set, people now had a time, interest, and means to express their individuality. Some Americans were now willing to pull away from the norms that had previously been established by the government.